I was under the impression that I had everything sorted out. Life felt good. Natalie and I had been married for over 25 years, and our daughter, Sophie, had just gotten married to Benjamin, a guy I genuinely appreciated. He was exactly the kind of man I had always envisioned Sophie would choose: dependable, hardworking, and respectful. I figured that in due time, they would bless us with grandkids, and we would all enjoy a picture-perfect family life. Yet, as the saying goes, the cracks had already begun to show. I just failed to notice them. Natalie, however, started picking up on things long before I did. Sophie was frequently coming home late, making up excuses about work or spending time with friends. I thought it was nothing serious, right? Newlyweds need their space. I shrugged it off like any typical dad would, telling Natalie she was just overreacting. But Natalie, she had always been sharp, almost too sharp for her own good at times. "Something feels off," she told me one evening after Sophie dropped by for dinner and spent more time staring at her phone than engaging with us. I glanced up from the TV, more irritated by the interruption than her actual comment. "What do you mean? Off? She's just busy. It's normal. You're making a mountain out of a molehill." But Natalie wouldn't let it slide. "Busy?" She didn't even glance at Benjamin the whole time. "He's completely oblivious. He has no idea, but something's going on. I can feel it." I rolled my eyes, more from habit than disbelief. Yet, deep down, a nagging thought started to creep in. What if Natalie was right? The thought that Sophie, my little girl, might be keeping secrets from us was deeply unsettling. I wasn't ready to admit it back then, but that seed had definitely been planted. Natalie began to dig deeper, asking probing questions. She couldn't resist. She'd call Sophie casually, inquiring about her day, using that laid-back approach women often have. Yet, the more Natalie tried to find out, the more Sophie seemed to retreat. I could hear the frustration, disappointment, and something I didn't want to recognize, fear, in Natalie's voice every night after she hung up the phone. "Michael, she's hiding something," Natalie asserted, pacing the kitchen late one night after yet another unfulfilling chat with Sophie. "She's avoiding me, avoiding both of us. Maybe she's just stressed out," I offered weakly. Honestly, I had no idea what else to say. What else was there to think? My mind wasn't ready to go where Natalie's already had. Then there were the phone calls Sophie would take in another room, the abrupt ends to conversations whenever Benjamin's name came up, and the excuses for why they couldn't join us for family dinners as frequently. All those little things started to pile up. Individually, they might not have meant much, but together, they were painting a picture I wasn't prepared to see. It wasn't long before Natalie's suspicions morphed into action. I noticed she was spending countless hours on social media, attempting to connect the dots, looking for anything that could explain Sophie's odd behavior. She even suggested the idea of following Sophie, something I outright rejected. That was a boundary I wasn't willing to cross. Not yet, at least. But Natalie wasn't going to wait for me to catch up. I could see changes in her, too. It wasn't just Sophie drifting away. Natalie was pulling away from me, frustrated that I wasn't taking her concerns seriously. And to be honest, that scared me the most. I thought our marriage was solid, but even that began to feel the strain of Sophie's secrets. Meanwhile, Benjamin, poor guy, was utterly clueless. He seemed completely unaware of any of this. Every time we saw him, he was cheerful as ever, chatting about work, their future, and vacation plans. He trusted Sophie, and that trust, it broke my heart to think how easily it could be shattered. Looking back, everything seems so clear now. The late nights, her phone permanently attached to her hand, Sophie's flimsy excuses, and the way she laughed nervously when asked direct questions. But when it's your child, and you're in the thick of it, you just don't want to acknowledge the truth. But Natalie wasn't going to drop it. One night, after weeks of quiet tension, she finally snapped. "I'm going over there," she declared suddenly, grabbing her keys from the counter. "What? Right now?" "Natalie, it's late." I was taken aback by her resolve, but I also knew there was no stopping her once she set her mind on something. She left her purse here the last time she visited. "I'll just drop it off. Maybe I'll find out more," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of hope and dread. I didn't argue. I didn't even try to go with her. I let her walk out the door, convincing myself this was just another one of Natalie's impulsive moments and that she'd return, and we'd laugh about how paranoid we both had been. But I couldn't have been more wrong. That night changed everything. Natalie came back hours later, and the moment she stepped through the door, I could tell something was very wrong. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and hollow. She looked like she had seen a ghost. "What happened?" I asked, my heart racing. I wasn't ready for her answer. Far from it. Natalie looked at me, and in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I saw her, Michael. I saw Sophie with another man." I remember that night, as if it were yesterday, how Natalie walked through the door, as white as a sheet, her hands trembling as she gripped her purse. I didn't need her to say anything for me to know something was terribly wrong. You can sense when someone has been struck by a truth that doesn't just alter a moment. It reshapes everything. Natalie inhaled deeply, her breath trembling, as if the mere act of speaking would make the situation too real. But she couldn't hold back any longer. "I saw her, Michael," she murmured. "Sophie, with another man." The world around me seemed to tilt. It felt like I'd been dealt a brutal blow to the stomach, sending me reeling. My instinct? Denial. That's the last thing any parent wants to hear. Not about their own child. You never expect to find yourself in a nightmare where your child, the very source of your pride, turns out to be someone you hardly recognize. "No," the words slipped out of my mouth before I could think twice, but somewhere deep inside, I knew Natalie was telling the truth. She didn't exaggerate. She never did. Natalie sank into a chair, her shoulders slumping as if all her strength had been drained away. Tremors ran through her body. I stepped closer, positioning myself in front of her, desperate to understand what was happening. "Well, what did you see?" Her gaze fixed on mine, revealing a whirlwind of fear, disgust, and confusion. I wanted to drop off her purse. I thought it would be a quick stop, you know? But when I got to her apartment, the lights were on, and I could hear voices coming from inside. I wasn't trying to snoop, Michael, I swear. But then I caught a glimpse of her through the window. She hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. She was in bed, with some guy. I stood frozen, my mind racing to catch up with the reality of her words. "Are you certain it was her? I mean, maybe it was—" "Don't even go there," Natalie interrupted, her voice shaking. "It was her, Michael, our daughter, and she saw me." I blinked in disbelief. "She saw you." The reality of it was hard to accept. "What did she say?" Natalie let out a hollow laugh that sent chills down my spine. "She invited me in." I was left speechless. My mind was struggling to grasp it all. "Invited you in? For what reason?" "To join the fun," Natalie shot back, her expression twisted with disbelief. She acted like it was nothing, like cheating on her husband was completely normal, as if I'd just go along with it. My stomach churned at the thought. My own daughter behaving like that? It was unfathomable. Sure, Sophie had always been headstrong, but this was a whole new ballgame. I felt my mind racing, trying to piece together any explanation for her actions. But there was nothing that made sense. Natalie began to pace, her words spilling out faster, more frantic. Of course, I told her no. I got out of there as quickly as I could, but she didn't even try to stop me. She didn't care. "Michael, our daughter, she doesn't care." I struggled to process her words. The shock of it all, the betrayal, the nonchalance Sophie displayed, left me reeling. I felt utterly lost. What could I possibly say? Everything was collapsing around me, and I was powerless to stop it. "She's not the girl we raised," Natalie said, her voice quivering. "She's different. I don't know when it happened, but she's not the same Sophie we once knew. And now we're trapped in this nightmare." I sank into a chair, burying my head in my hands. I felt completely powerless, caught between the instinct to protect Sophie and the gnawing betrayal that clawed at my insides. What was I supposed to do? How do you mend something that feels this broken? "We have to confront her," Natalie said, suddenly resolute. "We need to face her. She must understand the weight of her actions." "Confront her?" I echoed, still reeling. "And what do we say? Hey, we know you're cheating on your husband. What were you thinking?" Natalie fixed me with a piercing gaze. "Yes, That's exactly what we need to say. I wasn't sure I was prepared for that. I wasn't ready for any of this. But what choice did we have? Sophie wasn't just making a mistake. She was destroying her life. And if we didn't intervene now, who knows how far she would fall. But it was more than that. The way Natalie described Sophie's reaction, the complete lack of remorse, the arrogance, made my stomach churn. This wasn't just about infidelity. It was something much darker. My little girl wasn't merely making a poor choice. She had transformed into someone I no longer recognized. In the days that followed, we barely exchanged words. The heavy reality of what Natalie had witnessed hung over us like a suffocating fog, choking any attempts at normal conversation. I kept hoping for Sophie to call, to confess, to show some sign of guilt. But she didn't. She carried on as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't been caught in a web of betrayal. The tension was unbearable. Natalie was losing sleep, her anxiety gnawing at her day after day. And as for me, I was filled with rage, not just directed at Sophie, but at myself. How had I missed the signs? How had I allowed things to spiral so far out of control without realizing? It was my duty to protect my family, to guide Sophie, and I felt like I had failed. One night, after another restless evening spent tossing and turning, Natalie made up her mind. We're talking to her. Tomorrow. I knew there was no use arguing. I understood she was right. We could no longer avoid this. So we devised a plan: confront Sophie at her apartment while Benjamin was out. We didn't want to blindside him until we understood just how deep this betrayal ran. We'd give Sophie a chance to explain herself, to come clean, to show that perhaps, just perhaps, there was some regret buried beneath this chaos. The next day arrived too quickly, and my stomach churned during the drive over. I dreaded this confrontation. I didn't want to hear her excuses or justifications. But I had to. For Natalie, for Benjamin, for my own sake. As we pulled up to Sophie's apartment, the weight of what lay ahead settled heavily in my chest. This was the pivotal moment that altered everything. I didn't realize it yet, but our family would be forever changed after this conversation. The drive to Sophie's apartment felt like an eternity. Natalie sat next to me, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her jaw clenched so hard I could hear her teeth grinding. I knew she was furious, but it was more than just anger. It was heartbreak, disappointment, and confusion all swirling together, ready to crash down on our daughter. As for me, I felt lost, caught in a fog of denial, hoping that if I just ignored the situation a little longer, everything would magically revert to how it used to be. But deep down, I understood better. This wasn't something we could just brush aside. When we finally pulled up to Sophie's building, we sat in the car for a few moments, frozen in place. It felt like we both needed a moment to gather ourselves before stepping into whatever awaited us inside. I turned to Natalie, my voice low and filled with uncertainty. What if she doesn't even care? What if she just brushes us off? Natalie shot me a steely glance. Then we face it. No more tiptoeing around. She has to understand the magnitude of what she's done. I nodded, although doubt lingered in my mind. I didn't want to face anything. I just wanted my daughter back. I yearned for the Sophie I knew, the one who would never dream of betraying her husband, to walk out and assure us this was all a misunderstanding. But I knew that wasn't going to happen. We made our way to the door, and my knuckles hesitated before they knocked. It felt surreal, knocking on my own daughter's door, as if I were an outsider intruding on her life. Seconds stretched into eternity, and for a moment, I wondered if she would even answer. Then the door creaked open, and there she stood, wearing that same defiant look in her eyes that had become all too familiar. "Mom, Dad, what's going on?" she asked, her tone almost casual, as if we had dropped by for a friendly chat. Without wasting a moment, Natalie declared, "We need to talk." Sophie's expression barely shifted. "Sure, come in." She stepped aside, allowing us to enter. As we walked in, the tension in the air was palpable, thick, and suffocating. Sophie didn't appear nervous or guilty. She seemed completely unfazed. Sitting down on the couch, she crossed her legs and regarded us with an air of indifference, as if she was simply waiting for us to spill whatever we had to say. Natalie was the first to break the silence, her voice sharp and icy. "We know, Sophie. We know what you've been doing." Sophie raised an eyebrow, feigning ignorance. "What are you talking about?" I couldn't contain my frustration. The casual act, the pretend cluelessness, it drove me over the edge. "Stop playing dumb with us. Natalie saw you. She saw you with another man." For a brief moment, I caught a flicker of something in Sophie's eyes. Maybe shock, maybe fear, but it vanished almost instantly. Instead, she leaned back, letting out a sigh as if we were the ones inconveniencing her. "Oh, that," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "I was going to tell you eventually." "Eventually?" Natalie echoed, her voice cracking with disbelief. "You were planning to tell us you were cheating on your husband eventually? What the hell, Sophie?" Sophie rolled her eyes, a move so infuriating that I had to clench my fist to keep from exploding. "Mom, you're being so dramatic. It's not that big of a deal." "Not that big of a deal?" I interjected, unable to hold back any longer. I stood up, pacing the room, my heart pounding in my chest. "Are you even listening to yourself? You're married, Sophie. You made a commitment to Benjamin, and now you're throwing it all away like it means nothing." Sophie didn't flinch. "I'm not throwing anything away. It's just different now." "Different?" Natalie shot back, her voice trembling with anger. "What does that even mean? Do you think you can just do whatever you want because you're bored?" Sophie shrugged, her demeanor calm and detached, as if we were the irrational ones for caring. "It's not about boredom. It's about freedom. Benjamin's great, okay? But I need more than just great. I crave excitement. I need something that makes me feel alive again." I was in disbelief. "And sleeping with another man behind your husband's back is how you find that excitement?" "Jesus, Sophie, what happened to you?" Her eyes narrowed, her tone shifting to one of defensiveness. "Nothing happened to me. I'm just being honest with myself. You and Mom live in this fantasy where marriage is some fairy tale that never changes, but that's not real life. People evolve. Relationships evolve." Natalie stood up now, her face drained of color, but filled with rage. "So, you just what? Cheat on the man who loves you because you need more? That's your solution?" Sophie didn't back down. "Look, I didn't plan for this, okay? It just happened. I wasn't searching for it, but when I met him, everything just clicked. I wasn't going to throw that away because of some antiquated notion of marriage." "Antiquated?" I snapped. "This isn't about old-fashioned marriage ideals, Sophie. It's about trust, commitment, loyalty. You made vows. You can't just walk away from that because you're feeling restless." Sophie looked at me as if I were the one who didn't understand. "You're acting like I've ruined everything, but I haven't. Benjamin doesn't even know. I can still fix this." "How?" Natalie asked, her voice barely more than a whisper now. "How do you plan to fix this?" "I'll tell him when the time is right," Sophie replied, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "I'll explain everything. He'll understand." Natalie let out a bitter laugh, a hollow sound that filled the room with tension. "You really think he's going to understand? That man loves you, Sophie. He trusts you. And you've been lying to him, sleeping with someone else behind his back. How could you do that to him?" Sophie averted her gaze, frustration breaking through her usual facade. "I didn't plan for it to spiral out of control. I thought I could manage it, but everything just got out of hand." I felt a surge of anger. "So what's next? Are you going to keep lying to him? Keep playing this game until it all crumbles around you?" "No," Sophie replied, her voice steady. "I'll end it. I just need a bit more time." Natalie shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "You really don't see it, do you? It's already falling apart. You're tearing your marriage apart, and you're completely blind to it." An unbearable silence filled the room. Sophie looked down, avoiding our gaze. It was clear she wasn't ready to confront the full impact of her choices. Maybe she never would be. Finally, I spoke, my voice strained and weary. "You need to tell him, Sophie. This can't stay a secret any longer. He deserves to know the truth." Sophie bit her lip, looking genuinely conflicted for the first time. "I will. Just give me a little more time." "No," Natalie insisted, her tone firm. "We're done giving you time. If you don't tell him, we will." Sophie's eyes widened in shock. "What? You can't do that." We can, I replied, rising from my seat and locking eyes with her. And we will. Benjamin deserves to know who he's married to. Sophie stood up, panic flashing across her features. You'll ruin everything. He won't understand. Natalie wiped a tear from her cheek, her voice cold and resolute. That's a risk we're willing to take. But you need to face the consequences of your actions. Sophie stood there, her face drained of color, her hands trembling slightly. I could sense her fear, not just of losing Benjamin, but of losing the life she had built and the carefully crafted image she had maintained. But there was no turning back now. The truth was out, and sooner or later, Benjamin would find out. As we stepped out of her apartment, an oppressive weight settled over me. This wasn't the end. It was merely the beginning. The drive home felt surreal. My mind was a whirlwind, replaying every infuriating word Sophie had said, every dismissive look she had thrown our way. I wished fervently that it were all just a terrible nightmare from which I could awaken, but the harsh reality pressed down on me like a ton of bricks. Natalie sat quietly beside me, her eyes still red from tears. I didn't know what to say or how to comfort her. Our daughter had torn our lives apart, and now we were about to dismantle Benjamin's world as well. Sleep eluded me that night. Neither of us found solace in slumber. We lay there, staring at the ceiling, the enormity of our next steps suffocating us both. I imagined the look on Benjamin's face when we delivered the news. The shock, the betrayal, the pain. He didn't deserve this. He was a genuinely good man, far too decent for someone like Sophie. By morning, my dread had only deepened. I could see Natalie struggling to hold herself together, pacing the kitchen, her hands shaking as she attempted to make coffee neither of us wanted to drink. How are we going to do this, Michael? She asked, her voice trembling. I had no answers. How do you break someone's heart like this? There was no easy way to do it, no gentle approach to soften the blow. We have to tell him, I finally said, though my words felt empty. It's the right thing to do. Natalie nodded, but I could see the pain etched in her features. She knew it was the right thing, but that didn't ease her anguish. We called Benjamin, asking him to come over because we needed to talk. I could hear the confusion in his voice. He probably assumed it was something trivial, maybe a family event or a simple update. I loathed what awaited him, despised it with every fiber of my being. When Benjamin arrived, he was all smiles, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in our hearts. He embraced Natalie warmly, offered me a firm handshake, and settled at the kitchen table, completely oblivious to the chaos that was about to erupt. What's going on? He asked, his easy smile still lighting up his face. Everything okay? Natalie couldn't find her voice. She just stared down at her hands, her expression pale and tense. I knew I had to take the lead. The weight of this truth felt like a mountain pressing down on me, threatening to crush me. Benjamin, I started, my throat tightening. We need to talk about Sophie. His brow furrowed, leaning forward with concern. Is she all right? Did something happen? I swallowed hard. This was the moment. She's been unfaithful to you. The words hung heavy in the air, suffocating the space between us. Benjamin blinked, staring at me as if he couldn't comprehend what I'd just said. What? His voice was barely above a whisper, filled with uncertainty. Natalie finally found her voice, though it trembled with emotion. I saw her. I saw her with another man, Benjamin. She didn't even try to hide it. His face twisted in confusion, disbelief, and then something darker, realization. He shifted his gaze between us, searching for any indication that this was all a mistake, a misunderstanding, anything that could explain the horror he was hearing. But there was nothing. We had nothing but the cruel truth. Benjamin leaned back in his chair, his face draining of color, his eyes widening in shock. No, that can't be true. Sophie wouldn't do that. She just wouldn't. She did, Natalie said, her voice cracking. She's been seeing someone else, and she didn't even care that I found out. She acted like it didn't matter. I watched Benjamin as the realization hit him, like a freight train. The disbelief, the denial, they shattered in an instant. His face fell, crumbling under the weight of the truth. He shook his head slowly, his voice barely a whisper. No, no, she wouldn't do that to me. I desperately wanted to offer him something, anything to cushion the impact of this revelation. But there were no words that could soften this blow. Nothing would make this any better. She did. I murmured softly, and I'm truly sorry. Benjamin's hands balled into fists on the table, his knuckles turning white. Who is it? He demanded through gritted teeth, fury and heartbreak lacing his voice. Who's the guy? Natalie and I exchanged a glance, both realizing we hadn't even thought to ask Sophie for his name. It hadn't crossed our minds until now, and suddenly I felt the weight of that oversight. But as I looked at Benjamin, I knew that his world was unraveling before us, and there was no way to stop it. I don't know, Natalie admitted, her voice barely rising above a whisper. I didn't recognize him. Benjamin stared at the table, lost in thought for a long moment. I could see the gears turning in his mind, the tumult of denial, anger, and heartbreak battling behind his eyes. I don't understand, he finally said, his voice so quiet I could barely hear it. I did everything right. I loved her. I supported her. I thought we were happy. The pain in his voice sliced through me like a dagger. I wanted to reassure him that none of this was his fault, that he hadn't caused this, but I knew he wasn't in a place to hear it. The betrayal was too fresh, too raw. We thought the same thing, I said gently. We didn't see this coming either. He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with a grief that was almost unbearable to witness. What am I supposed to do now? Natalie reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm. Take your time, she said softly. Process this. You don't have to make any decisions right now. But I understood the truth, that Benjamin would have to make choices, and soon. There was no going back from this. Sophie's betrayal had shattered their marriage, and no amount of time or processing could fix that. Benjamin nodded slowly, but the devastation in his eyes was evident. He wasn't ready to face it, but deep down, he knew he would have to confront the harsh reality of his wife's infidelity sooner or later. He left shortly after, moving with a heaviness that spoke of his burden. Natalie and I watched him go, our hearts heavy with guilt and sorrow. We had just torn his world apart, and there was no way to undo that damage. For a long time, silence enveloped us. What was there to say? We had done what was necessary, but it didn't feel right. Nothing about this felt right. Days passed in a haze of unspoken words and heavy hearts. I could see the toll it was taking on Natalie. She wasn't sleeping, barely eating. The guilt consumed her, even though none of this was her fault. I was struggling too, constantly thinking about Benjamin, wondering how he was coping with the devastating truth. Then one evening, there was a knock at the door. It was Benjamin. He looked like a ghost of his former self, haggard and worn, his eyes bloodshot and haunted. Yet, there was a calmness about him, a sense of resolution that hadn't been there before. I've decided, he said quietly, standing in our doorway. Natalie and I exchanged glances, bracing ourselves for whatever was coming next. I'm going to divorce her. His words hit me like a punch to the gut, even though I had anticipated this moment. Benjamin's voice was steady, but I could see the pain etched in his features. This wasn't an easy decision. It was the only one left to him. I can't live with someone who doesn't respect me, he said, his voice wavering slightly. I deserve better. He was absolutely right. He did deserve better. And as much as it hurt to acknowledge it, I knew this was the only way forward for him. We're here for you, I said softly, stepping closer to place a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Whatever you need. Benjamin nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Thank you. With that, the decision was made. Sophie's betrayal had shattered her marriage, and there was no going back. The weeks following Benjamin's decision to divorce Sophie felt surreal, like watching a slow-motion car crash. I knew it was coming, but witnessing it unfold was painful, an experience I could hardly bear. The weight of everything that had transpired settled heavily upon us, choking any hope we had left for Sophie. Natalie and I stayed in close contact with Benjamin throughout the ordeal. He moved out of their apartment, unwilling to remain anywhere near Sophie after everything that had happened. Natalie and I helped him pack his belongings, trying to provide support in any way we could. But nothing could alleviate the raw pain he was experiencing. I recall one evening when Natalie and I were slumped at the kitchen table, utterly drained from the relentless emotional upheaval. She looked at me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, and asked, "What are we going to do, Michael? How do we fix this?" I had no answers. For the first time in my life, I felt completely helpless. Sophie's reckless choices had dismantled the family we had worked so hard to build, and the idea of putting the pieces back together felt utterly impossible. As the divorce dragged on, Sophie's behavior became more erratic, as if she were living in a bubble, oblivious to the wreckage of her marriage. When we confronted her, hoping for some glimmer of remorse, she dismissed our concerns as if they were insignificant. "I'm not sorry," she declared one day, her voice laced with defiance. "I'm living my life for me. If you can't handle that, that's your problem, not mine." After that conversation, something inside Natalie broke. She dissolved into tears, sobbing with a depth of pain I'd never witnessed before. It was more than just sadness. It was a profound sense of betrayal. Sophie wasn't merely cheating on Benjamin. She had betrayed us, her parents, who had always stood by her. As we sat in the heavy silence that followed, Natalie turned to me, her expression a mix of determination and despair. "We need to make a decision, Michael. We can't keep going like this." I understood what she meant. Sophie's betrayal had gone far beyond infidelity. It had severed the ties that bound us as a family. We had discussed it before, but neither of us had wanted to voice the unthinkable. Yet there it was, staring us in the face. "We have to disinherit her," Natalie said, her voice trembling but resolute. "She doesn't deserve it. She doesn't respect what we built together. It's time to set boundaries." I nodded, the gravity of that decision pressing down on me. The thought of cutting Sophie off like this felt like a betrayal in itself. But Natalie was right. Time and again, she had shown that she didn't value the principles we had raised her with. She had sacrificed everything for a momentary thrill, and it seemed she felt no remorse. The following day, we made it official. We met with our lawyer and took the painful step to have Sophie removed from our will. It felt gut-wrenching, but it had to be done. We could no longer enable her destructive behavior. When Sophie discovered what we had done, her fury erupted. She burst into our home one evening, her face flushed with rage. "How could you do this to me?" she screamed, her voice echoing through the house. "I'm your daughter. You can't just cut me off." Natalie, who had remained quiet throughout this ordeal, finally unleashed her pent-up frustration. "You are our daughter, Sophie, but that doesn't give you the right to obliterate everything we've built. You've betrayed your husband. You've betrayed us. We can't just pretend everything's okay." Sophie's face twisted with anger, but beneath it, I could see a flicker of something else, fear perhaps, or a hint of regret. But it was too late for that now. She had made her choices, and now she had to deal with the fallout. "I didn't ask to be born into your old-fashioned views on family and loyalty," she shot back. "You're the ones who can't accept that life isn't black and white." "That may be true," I interjected, stepping closer, my voice steady but firm, "but every action has consequences. You made your choices, Sophie, and now you have to live with them." Her expression hardened, and she shook her head defiantly. "You're making a mistake. You'll regret this." "No, Sophie," Natalie replied softly, her voice heavy with sorrow. "The only regret we have is that you've become someone we don't even recognize anymore." With that, Sophie stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The sound reverberated through our home, marking the end of something that had already been broken long before that moment. In the months that followed, life didn't get easier. It simply became clearer. Sophie drifted further away, evolving into a mere shadow of the daughter we once adored. She made no effort to mend our relationship, nor did she express any sign of remorse. Instead, she buried herself deeper into a world that felt alien to us, distancing herself from the love and values we had instilled in her. Meanwhile, Benjamin, despite the heartache, remained woven into the fabric of our lives. It felt strange at first, maintaining a close bond with our ex-son-in-law, while our own daughter felt like a distant memory. But he had been nothing but good to us, and we refused to turn our backs on him simply because Sophie had made her disastrous choices. He came over for dinners, shared holidays with us, and even joined in on family celebrations. In many ways, he became the son we had always hoped Sophie would choose. His presence served as a reminder that even amid the darkest clouds, there was still light to be found. As for Sophie, she remained an emotional stranger. Our contact was minimal, consisting of cold, impersonal messages exchanged occasionally. It was evident that the damage she inflicted was too profound to mend. We still loved her. Of course we did. But the person she had become was one we couldn't embrace any longer. As time passed, Natalie and I learned to find our footing again. We discovered a new peace in our relationship, leaning on each other to navigate the painful reality of our family's fracture. It wasn't easy, but we grew stronger together, finding comfort in the life we had rebuilt. Sophie's choices had cost her a place in our family, but they had also imparted a painful lesson. Sometimes, love isn't enough. Sometimes, no matter how deeply you care, people will choose paths that lead them away from you. As much as that hurt, it was a reality we had to accept. Life continued on, albeit slowly. Benjamin began to pick up the pieces of his life, rediscovering happiness in ways I had once thought impossible. Natalie and I focused on our future, cherishing small moments of joy, even as the specter of Sophie's betrayal lingered in the background. We would never be the same, but we had found a way to endure. In the end, that was all we could hope for.